Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 898. I will today talk about the Husserlian concepts of pretension and retention. They also form a significant part in the philosophy of Henri Bergson, and as something that I will later take up, Susie Frobel from a neurolinguistic perspective, how time works. And it is fair to say it starts with Henri Bergson. He is not happy with the regular division with now, past and present. And he thinks it doesn't do justice to how the flow of time works. And the flow of time in the philosophy of Henri Bergson is also part of his bigger flow, the élan vital. Élan vital has a lot of similarities to the holographic movement, or the holo movement in the scientific theory of David Bohm. I think it could be fair to say that this movement is the alternate taking place of pretension, which is the forward thrust, voluntary physical forward thrust of the individual or a group, and the backward thrust of the retention. And what the difference is compared to the regular time or the classical time is that the classical time is made by an observer in a definite position, a here, both in space and time. So it's a combination of being here and now. And when I say here and now, one also realizes this is a static position. This is once more the position of the theater. The theater is a very good example on how we perceive both time and space in the Western logocentric tradition. We are onlookers on time passing, as we are also onlookers in a general sense, from the origo sense of space. So I think it's, in some ways, it's fair to say that the origo and the now take somewhat similar positions, but there are differences, important differences. But for sort of an introductory text, I think this is enough to say that there are actually some parallels going on here. It could be helpful. You will come a little bit off. You won't be completely correct, but as all pedagogical tools, they bring you just a little bit off, and then you adjust it once you learn it more by practical device. The pretension, which I will start with, it's an active process where you so to speak, will the future, or you do the future. You don't let the future come to you. It's an active process where you almost want the future to happen. That is pretension. And I can tell for my own sake, I feel the difference when I really want something, that is a more vivid future. Things seems to click much more in place. It's a little bit like playing pool, and you shoot at the white ball and everything goes into the right holes. That is pretension. Whereas future and planning, which is maybe I call planning this time, the regular way of planning is like making scenes in your head about the future, but they are stale, they are solid, they are like old memories, and you put them together in a static format. You pile them on top of each other, and each of these old things are like bricks, unmovable, square, and they add on. So the more bricks you put on, the harder it is to actually get into the future. And you get different constellations of these brick systems, which you call planning, but it's actually a lot hindering. Bergson was of the same view. He said, your general perception of time will limit or further your possibility of making good decisions, because in the future and the planning there is very little predicative. In the regular way of making plans, there is very little predicative power, so your decisions will not be successful. We know also, from instance, I mentioned earlier, Ben Ariely, but also James Clear, which we looked into when we were in Sköllersta, like 300-400 episodes ago. It's going quickly. He shows that we are really bad at planning these days, and what he means is that we do not do pretension. Pretension is a thinking process, whereas this other way is a way of repeating in your head different sequences, different scenes, and scenes are a concept coming from theater and the cinema, and that simply won't work. It's like stale side products, biprodukter of products of memory, and we try to put them together. This was actually very well depicted by Edward de Bono in one of his least read books called Water Logic, where he compared two different systems of logic. One he called stone logic, where every piece was like memory books that you put together in order to make something within industry or commerce, because he was usually working there, having solid pieces that could not be molded. Maybe Henry would call them objects. I don't know if it's fitting. Maybe objects are more lenient. I think so. But the general perception here is that they are heavy and you put them on top of each other. How could I get an example of the flavor of this? Well, I think many times it's too many factors for me to plan, for instance, a vacation tomorrow in, let's say, Malmö or some, just make something up. And I all of a sudden feel that there's so much hand luggage. What should I bring drinks to the trip? I have something to drink on the way. Maybe a big water bottle, coffee, some sandwiches. And in the end, it's so many different objects. This is ineffective thinking. Instead, you think first and then you act. And that is the working process of the brain when it works well. So you do pretension. You don't try to fix different things that you already somehow think the future is regulated or already out there. You let the openness of an unknown future, but unknown in a knowable way, lead you, and that your decisions will actually influence. So one could say that the view of Edmund Husserl and Henri Bergson is a more open view. It's not so locked down in sort of a stale history. And his pretension is very similar to the flow everybody's talking about these days. I felt I was in the flow when I went skiing in Bad Gastein, I heard the other day. And being in the flow is thinking ahead, not waiting for the things to come up in your head. The different scenery turns up immediately, and they are always connected to sort of mild stress, friction, and that can be felt. A little bit like you wake up in the morning and the first thing you start thinking about, oh, I need to do the laundry later on, and it becomes something of a demand. You are not voluntarily doing the thinking anymore. The thinking does itself. And compare this to the previous lecture when I said that the representationalist world is something that you create yourself as time goes by. It's not taking any external, any exogenous, with this complicated word, which I actually quite like, exogenous. Endogenous is more internal. The reason I like these terms is they give a more active sense to what's going on, a direction, so to speak, and they're not as definite. If you speak about inner and outer, we have a general perception of one being blocked from the other, and there is no connection somewhere. It's like wall. Endogenous, exogenous, very good terms. I would later, hopefully I can make another lecture, talk about Susan Froebel and her fractal view, where both we are fractal and time is fractal. And it's more about being a fractal consciousness or a fractal thingy, looking into fractality. And that's most interesting. I won't digress here, but to put in parenthesis, the fractality of the world is so complicated it looks like consciousness. And it has repeatable things, and it has a sort of willed nature. Potentially, it could be helpful to think about those things to help ease these concepts up. Because they are tough, both Bergson and Husserl, in the reason, because we have already firmly established structures about this. Most people do. And how time flows, we are no longer good at perceiving that. For instance, in most countries they have a sort of a pause at the end of the afternoon, and we stopped sensing that pause. We used to have it even here in Western Europe or Northern Europe before we go down, and we don't understand that we need to catch the moment in the same way, because thinking is more open and then it closes itself, and just by watching or understanding this process we get more into the rhythm of both time and space. It is of course very helpful to think where you are situated. For instance, the shop we visited yesterday is in that direction, and seeing the shop and the bank who said that and all the class, that makes me be more present. So retention is something I get into now with this segue. And retention, in contrast to past, retention is also more active. Past is something that just happens to you. Like you sit down and you fall together and you start, oh, the past. It could be good things, could also be bad things. And this past is monosemic, usually, or more into the direction of monosemic. It is more decided. It doesn't have this open fractality to it, where you can look at it from different perspectives. And when there is only one meaning, it gets flat, and it doesn't get that informative. Bergson meant that time itself, and this is also the view of Husserl, had dimensions. Whereas we normally think of time as just one line, and this line is in itself very crowded. It doesn't allow for much things to happen. And I often feel this. I mentioned earlier, I spoke to a local worker at the parish, and I asked her if we could have permission to record. I got a yes, and the timeline was so strict, so the next sentence came automatically from my side, and I sort of busted myself. This is the sense of a definite timeline, because you are in it. You are like a locomotive. You cannot be stopped, and you don't have any choice anymore, because you are locked by a cause and effect. I think this is an interesting part of the past, that we often think it's unmoldable, unchangeable. It's in the past, as we say. Nothing can be done. On the contrary, Husserl says, the past is a great source of much knowledge, information, deepening, but you need to see retention as an active thinking process, a moving process, and that everything that you experienced can be seen differently. And the more difference you put in, the more reality you get. So it's a difference in level. This linear time has less to it. It's more determined, it's less you in it. It's not partaking in something that's endogenous and something that is outside, that radical otherness of time. And this is both Henri Bergson and Husserl's view, that there was something out there. It's not the view of an analytical philosopher. For him, out there is something he has in his beetle box, something only he can speak about, not something shared. I had a great instance in our old rap teacher, as we called them, Dagge Westerståhl. We always did this rapping side. Dagge was the king, because in one lecture he said, this is true in itself. And then it just got too weird for us. He made himself true somehow. And we all got the feeling, because we saw his tired face. He looked exhausted. And he must have been younger than I am now, but he looked absolutely ravished. It's a terrible thought to make yourself true in that way. This is direct reflection with no chance of anything exogenous coming in. And this is escape from reality rather going into reality. And I didn't have any words to put on it at that time. We just didn't like it. None of us did. I don't think he liked it either. But it was the same direction he was heading for. And this is, interestingly enough, as I mentioned his facial feature of Dag Westerståhl, the rap teacher. It was anything but a rap teacher. But when he said his truth in itself, it's also very obvious with the posture. He sank literally together. And not being active in your futuring or your pasting, if we make it to verbs, it has a muscular side. This is this locking the knees, locking the hips, having much more of the T2 muscles, the one that gets tired, the one that makes you feel it being a little bit of an effort to stand, sit, be, I would say, even to exist and do your common things. It's a strain on it. And it's this frictionful attitude, the idea that everything is done already and the only thing you can do is sink together, slouch or collapse into yourself. And this collapsing tendency is the same thing going into the spiral that goes down, because you lock yourself from the exogenous, the outside, the radically different. So you can see here, the previous lecture, I talked more about space, but now it's more about time. But the tendency are very similar, in this case very similar. It's going into the rhythm of the outer time. Not really, but almost like if you want to catch a train that's already on the move, you need to move yourself. So if you wait for the train, If it's moving past you and you try to jump on it, it will be very hard. Very, very hard. But if you run a little bit like this, you go into the rhythm of the train, and then you can be on it. As I often mentioned before, in Japan the trains, the metro goes exactly on time. And I would say one of the reasons is they don't have this rather clumsy now, ima. They have a word for it, but never use it technically. Because once one person's now is another person's now. It's not the same. If you want to get the trains to go on time, we need to get into the rhythm of time. It needs to be a movement. Something needs to be done. The trains need to be serviced. They need to be driven. They need to be. It needs to be an awareness. You need the intention, and it's the level of intention that Bergson and Husserl are pointing to. It's a difference in attitude. It's a difference in wanting. It's always like a graded scale or a fractal scale. It's not absolute here. You will never say that, this morning between 9 and 10 I was in this pretension and retention. I really felt in the flow. Could say, but it wouldn't really sound good. It's a level thing, and when you have this marvelous flow movement, I remember one time, actually close to here at the billiard palace or whatever it's called, Biljardhallen, I had this feeling for maybe half of the night that all the balls really got into the places. It didn't suddenly cease to exist, and it didn't suddenly come to existence. It was a graded scale. It was nice when it disappeared, and it lingered in my memory, because I think that was the only time I won actually in pool after having playing the thing with Magnus and Claes for 3-4 years. In some ways it's the same with these lectures, that they need to be in rhythm somehow. I can't always force them into action. Well, I can do it in some ways. I notice when I sit down and write, I've been doing it regular for maybe a year now, it comes more naturally. So there is also this thing with schedule, but it needs to be both. It needs to be schedule and spontaneous, and the one doesn't exclude the other one. And this is something you need to practice rather than understand directly, because it feels like it's impossible to have a schedule when you want to be spontaneous. Maybe in a way, especially in the beginning, it is, but once you get into it, it is not that. And that has also to do with the metro system in Japan, because our way of thinking is some sort of idealistic situation where there's no obstacles. Hello, there are 30 million people living in the Tokyo center metro area. There are bound to be things that happens, and then you really need the rhythm rather than a fixed schedule, because otherwise you be only in that fixed schedule. So they both are needed, and the better you get at getting into the rhythm, the more you can have a schedule. And maybe that's the reason I really felt when I visited one of these temples in Japan, that the monks were incredibly spontaneous, although they were having a schedule that was murder. For me, it was murder. Getting up every morning at 5:30, everything in my life was completely regulated. And then people asked me, was it nice? Well, for me it wasn't nice, but it was nice for the other one. And that is that the subjects come into play. Depends how trained is the subject, the individual. I wasn't that trained. For me it was a nightmare. But I noticed these people, although so heavily disciplined from something that looked like an authoritarian abbot, was actually incredibly spontaneous as states. When I experienced my first earthquake, it wasn't us Westerners that reacted first. It was these monks, and they were quick as hell, sorry the French. They were incredibly quick. And they came as a surprise. I thought they were zombies. I didn't form a positive idea of them for really bad reasons, a biased perspective. They were incredibly spontaneous. And I would say the same goes for art. I mentioned this before, but when I started to study art, I was encouraged, do whatever you want, let your inner come out, all those things. And it didn't work for me, and neither did it work for anyone else. So we all got these similar looking drawings that looked like somebody threw up on them. And I actually made a joke when the teacher approached me and said, let your inner come out. Do you want me to vomit, or what do you want? It's just this exaggerated, one-sided view of what creativity is. Here's a good point from our dear guru when it comes to marketing and creativity, the sadly passed away Edward de Bono, who also said, to be creative you need a very hard discipline, because you need to tell your system when to be creative, and intermix it too much, you will lose both discipline and creativity. And this was actually the case with Picasso. He had his very regular scale. I think he started quite late. He was more like me, like a night person. He started like 3 o'clock and continued till 4 o'clock in the morning. He always did that every day, no exception. And maybe you don't like Picasso, but it would be very hard to argue that he wasn't a creative person. The memories, or whatever the scenery you call in the old view of past, are very similar, or somewhat similar maybe, to the objects in space. The ego has its perception, the ego and the object gets constructed simultaneous. The same goes for the now and its fixed moments. They get constructed completely simultaneous. So you think that the ego looking at the moments, either in past or in future, are both real because they come into existence simultaneously like this at the very same time. Both Husserl and Bergson mentioned that. But I won't say I won't repeat what they say. In this case, it's much more interesting what Susie Frobel wrote. So I get into that in the next lecture. But she has a very keen understanding that it is extremely difficult to come out of that, I don't know, illusion or stuckedness. Just because they happen at the same time, the memories or the future, you get the feeling they come from nowhere. And things coming from nowhere is usually the stamp on reality this time. But something I have or shared could be something of a mistake. We are free people here, we can trick ourselves into believing something, or a whole nation like Germany during the the Middle War interim. No, it's differently situated. It's when we're participating in the exogenous that we become real. And the other one is the wanting to be real. There is a difference there. Although in the beginning, when you're starting to get those two papers that are already stuck together like this, it is very hard to find a point where you can put in your nail and sort of separate them. And you see that there is a difference. And this can actually be done in this case too. When you start feeling that the ego or the origo or the now, whatever you call it, depending on its time or space, it is a little before the other thing. And once you see that, the whole construct or the whole system becomes a little bit less real. And you start feeling it's moldable. And you start understanding after a while, and this may be in the future, that your mindset, your awareness, as Ian McKilkris is talking about, is a choice. And your awareness decides, I think he uses the word attention. Says that classical physics is a different attention than the more encompassing right side of the brainwave take on the world. And it also has to do with my focus. Looking into the camera here, I instantly start to take away what's behind me and especially above me. But when that comes into the picture, it's a strengthening of the focus, oddly enough. So the little thing is not in opposition to the encompassing everything around me. And actually, by taking in the surrounding, which I think should be kicked out because it's not part of reality, it's not part of my body, the exact opposite happens. I become more here, and more of an individual, more existing, more present. So it's not so much the actual impetus, I said the other way, to want to presence that is the bad thing. You really need to understand it instead. And that understanding came in quantum physics. It came with the Gödel theorem in 1926. It was necessary that the exogenous somehow knocked on the door to tell something is wrong, because this can never ever be internally developed or understood. This is why we need quantum mechanics. We need an incredibly interesting understanding from Gödel. For me, it's especially interesting because he did not want that. That was the last thing he wanted. Actually, the whole community of mathematicians were absolutely shocked. And a lot of them actually went into very severe mental diseases. I don't know if you know about what happened to Gödel. Henrik? He starved himself to death because of his own revelation. Starved himself to death. He could not eat. And you need to understand what a disaster this is for most people. Most people, it's a complete disaster. But as you probably understood by now, I don't think so. This is not my view. And I share rather the view of Henri Bergson and Edmund Husserl. This is actually an incredible opportunity. And you can both have the cake and eat it. You can have everything that the Gödel and Hilbert wanted, but you can have much more also. You don't lose anything in this process. And I don't say that to be selling in the message. I think this is an important property of it works, because blockage never costs anything to take away. Other things will cost. If you're talking about some other matter, it will be a cost. Even to get into good condition, that will be a cost. I will have to actually get my muscles inflamed. I break them. So there is a cost in pain and energy. But in this process, there is zero cost, because these are obstacles of a different nature. They are not to be forced, because of the very reason they are more part of knowledge. To get more knowledge, you just get it. It's fascinating, it's invigorating, it's sheer joy. For me, it's sheer joy. Like in this instance, when I have the Last of the Sun, and I really enjoy it. It's like a joyful movement. And linger on to that, because once you connect that to the more space you feel, and nothing of yourself disappears. Nothing. Zero. Nothing of time disappears. You get more time. But it is important to, you don't have to do like a choice like, what was her name, Angela thought when we had this podcast with, I forgot his name, Magiskt tänkande, magical thinking. And she persisted in the idea that either you go on vacation and you don't think of your problems, or you have problems when you're working. It's not this choice here. Actually, both work and vacation will get empowered by this. Look at the Japanese. This is going into the rhythm of time. It makes time works better. And as I mentioned in the next lecture, this is also has complete support from topology, mathematics of fractality, and science. enough for now. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you, Excellent.